This pomp and circumstance is the most splendid face of the infantryman's life. The weapon drills, the gorgeous uniforms, the disciplined formations are now just part of a glittering ceremony. But it wasn't always so. Once they were essential for victory on the battlefield, and the thin red lines on parade here are a reminder of the harsh reality of the infantryman's job. It is he who must go forward to close with and to kill the enemy. It is he who must seize the ground and hold it. And he must do this on foot, armed only with what he can carry, at the mercy of the elements and over every sort of terrain. There's nothing remote about war for the infantryman. For him, war has, and has always had, a very personal dimension. The infantryman is the pawn in the game of war. His work is unromantic and unremitting. He lives on his feet and by his wits, hung about with equipment, carrying his personal weapon, trying to stay vigilant despite the monotony. For the British rifleman on patrol in Northern Ireland, there's no prospect of a set-piece battle, just the constant threat of the sniper's bullet. And the infantryman's universal experience of having to do his soldiering far from home.
Hello. At school today?
We're not night. We're not night.
Why is that? You go to school on a Tuesday around here?
But we had to get our dinner first.
It's still dinner time, is it?
The Roman legionary also knew all about hours of sentry duty in distant outposts. He had the same concerns as other generations of infantrymen, getting a hot meal, keeping his kit clean, and going out on patrol. When the legionary marched out of camp, he carried his world with him. Helmet, weapons, equipment, rations, about 60 pounds in all, much the same as the British foot soldier carried on the Somme in 1916. In ancient Rome, the infantryman was nicknamed Marius's mule. In Vietnam, they called him the Grunt.
A grunt is an infantryman who has a couple of 100 pounds of gear on his back. He hasn't slept regularly, he hasn't eaten regularly, he hasn't washed or shaved regularly, and he's probably wearing the same clothes for 3 or 4 days. And I think the term grunt evolves from the sounds that you make once you sit down. If you have a pack on your back that weighs 60 or 80 pounds, bandoliers of ammunition, and a cartridge belt that's another 80 pounds, when you get up, you grunt. When you walk, you grunt. Everything becomes an effort. Anytime there's a firefight, anytime there's any kind of an incident, most of this gear is dropped. But for the most part, you're trudging through the bush, wearing packs, helmets, in some cases a flak jacket. But in the vast cases, armaments, ammunition, carrying a rifle, you're a bearer, we didn't have pack horses, you were your own pack horse.
The Napoleonic infantryman shouldered a crushing load. Musket, powder, ball, bayonet, short sword, water bottle and pack. In the pack went shirts, socks, washing, cleaning kit and greatcoat. One soldier wrote that many of our infantry sank and died under the weight of their knapsacks alone. It's a burden that hasn't changed much down the years. The sheer weight of weapons and equipment still makes the infantryman's life hard.
McGuinness, you keep stopping, you're going to make me annoyed. And you'll be going down the hill and up it and down it for the rest of the day. Now get yourself moving. Get moving. Move. You aren't trying. You're not even sweating. You're resting every 5 minutes. Move yourself. Go.
Then do the rest by yourself.
Come on, Stevie. Oh, I can't walk.
Go by yourself. Do the top by yourself.
Get off your rifle. Get off your rifle. It's not a walking stick. Well and done. Get yourself moving.
Well done,
son. Bloody disaster.
This looks like old-fashioned training, but it's what modern war was like in the Falklands. If Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, then Goose Green was won on the Brecon Beacons.
the terrain itself is the major part of the infantryman's job, because 99.9% of the job is covering the ground. It doesn't matter whether it's the snows of Norway or the Falklands or the desert. It's fighting your way through those obstacles, wading the river, getting up that next hill and the next one, and down the other side, fixing the rope so you can climb up the cliff and getting down the other side, and fighting your way through the elements. And then and only then do you actually get to grips with the enemy.
Before he can get to grips with the enemy, the infantryman has first to cross that dangerous space in between. It may be a no man's land of shell craters, or the Channel on the way to the Normandy shore.
I don't know how long we were actually in the Channel. Quite some time, it seemed, with all issued with brown paper bags to be sick in and so on. And the feeling, I think, it seems to me, was curiously resigned. I can't remember actually feeling much apprehension.
I know in my case, I kept wondering really what was going to happen to me. Would I ever get back home? You know, I kept thinking of my mother and my girlfriend, and I just wondered if I would make it, you know.
I think the first time when one really sort of got a sinking feeling, rather like a boxer before he goes into a ring, was as one moved towards the shore, when there was an enormous amount of fire, mostly our own, a great deal of noise. By the time we got a few hundred yards off the shore, of course, fire was coming in our direction.
Finally put the ramp down, I said to myself, how come he's putting it down now? Why can't we go in further? Because when he dropped us off, we were in water, I'd say knee-high, but in areas it was up to our neck. And I had come to like the security of being in that boat.
Such feelings are as old as man. In 55 BC, the Romans were equally reluctant to disembark and confront British tribesmen on the shore of Kent. Julius Caesar tells how an eagle-bearer gave the lead. He shouted, "Jump down, soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. It shall be told that I did my duty to my country and my general." He jumped overboard and began to wade ashore. Crossing the last few hundred yards is the hardest of all. The enemy is no longer a distant, impersonal figure. He's close, threatening, and his weapons are deadly. The Greek Xenophon watched the Persians deploy for the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC. When they got nearer, then suddenly there were flashes of bronze and the spear points, and the enemy formations became visible. The two lines were hardly 600 or 700 yards apart when the Hellenes began to chant the battle hymn and moved against the enemy. When firearms came to dominate the battlefield, the advancing infantry had to run the gauntlet of musketry and artillery fire. Captain Charles Forsythe was at Borodino in 1812. Our regiment was ordered to advance. When we reached the crest of the ravine, we were riddled with grape shot. Then came the searing volleys of close-range musketry. As the years went by, firepower grew in range and accuracy. In the American Civil War, the experience faced by the foot soldiers as they advanced became grim indeed. On the 3rd of July, 1863, At the height of the Battle of Gettysburg, 15,000 Confederate infantry marched up this gentle slope towards the Union lines at the top. Some shells burst among them long before they neared the crest. But when they were about 200 yards from it, the defending infantry and artillery opened fire simultaneously. Canister from the guns plowed through the Confederates, and their ranks were raked with massed rifle fire. The advancing soldiers were actually hidden under a cloud of dust, with, in the air above it, all sorts of debris, muskets, knapsacks, portions of bodies. A Union officer recalled that when the shot and shells struck the advancing infantry, a moan went up from the field, distinctly to be heard amid the roar of battle. About half the attacking troops were hit, and one Confederate later lamented, "We gained nothing but glory and lost our bravest men." 60 years later, infantry had a similar problem on the Western Front as they went forward across no man's land to attack the trenches opposite. It was often a costly business, as Charles Carrington learned.
I knew it would be a very expensive battle. I went into action with 3 officers, myself and 2 others under me, 13 NCOs, and 109 men. And I came back with 1 officer, myself, 2 NCOs, and with 44 men.
Then comes the moment when the infantryman meets his enemy. For centuries, although battle involved thousands of men, combat was a series of individual fights, and most of the damage was done within the short radius of a man's sword arm. Even firearms did not end close combat. In 1689 at Killiecrankie in Scotland, government troops found their muskets and plug bayonets no answer for charging Highlanders, plying dirk and broadsword. Even in the 20th century, there are times when the infantryman finds himself fighting hand-to-hand, man against man.
When I went into hand-to-hand combat with the enemy, I really didn't like that person, whoever he may be. Consequently, I didn't even think of him as another human being. I just saw him as an enemy that had to be defeated. And at the time that I sunk my bayonet into his body, I didn't really give it too much thought then, but when it come time to pull out my bayonet, I found that it was quite difficult. And so I couldn't do it by just pulling it out, so I had to fire my rifle into his chest so that at the same time I could pull my round out. And I think I wasn't satisfied. I used the butt of my rifle and struck him somewhere on the head. I don't know exactly, to make sure that it was all over, you know. He wasn't coming back at me.
Come on, take up the door. Get position up here.
The infantryman has got a peculiar ability which really not vested in anybody else. In the middle of a battle, he can take a decision to take cover in a convenient fold in the ground and take no further part in the battle, or he can lie in the bottom of his slit trench when the enemy artillery is pouring down round about him. Or alternatively, he can take the opposite decision, which is to throw his all into a single act of great courage and gallantry. That ability isn't vested with others. If you're in a tank, you go where your tank goes. If you're with an artillery piece, you go where that goes. But this particular ability of the infantryman to make his own decision is something which is peculiar to him.
If in some essentials the experience of the infantryman has changed remarkably little, in one fundamental respect it has undergone a revolution. The personal weapon he uses has altered beyond all recognition. It's the capabilities of that weapon that dictate the sort of battle he faces and fights. Nowadays, he will use and meet something like this. It's a rifle, of course. It's the Soviet-designed Kalashnikov AK-47, perhaps the most common of all 20th century infantry weapons. But it's a comparatively recent phenomenon. For most of war's long history, it was edged weapons that shaped the infantryman's experience. The Roman legionary relied upon his short sword, the gladius, and spent hours learning how to use it effectively. The historian Josephus wrote that it would not be wrong to describe their drills as bloodless battles and their battles as bloody drills. Men sparred with overweight weapons and wicker shields. It was a rough and bruising business, but it worked. And training like this went on from one end of the empire to the other. Before closing in with the sword, the legionary threw his pilum, a wooden spear with a long iron tip. When it hit a shield, for instance, the pilum penetrated and bent. It was then impossible for the enemy to pull out the spear. It often weighed them down, and they couldn't throw it back. In the centuries that followed the breakup of the Roman Empire, the infantryman lost his mastery of the battlefield. Pride of place went instead to the knight, whose armored shock was to warfare in the Middle Ages what tank attack was to 20th century blitzkrieg. He crashed through the pitiful infantry of the age and feared only his own kind. For sheer weight and hitting power, there was nothing to match him. The English archer changed all that. His weapon was the longbow, made of yew, often with a draw weight of over 100 pounds. It took a strong man to use it. His arrows, tipped with an armor-piercing bodkin point, were lethal at 250 yards. A skilled man could fire between 10 and 20 in a minute. At Crecy in 1346, as at Agincourt 70 years later, the English drew up their army in 3 bodies of dismounted men-at-arms and spearmen, each flanked by archers, who strengthened their position with sharpened stakes. French knights, eager to ride down the outnumbered English, surged forward in a charge which seemed irresistible. But they met an immovable object in the English archers. The chronicler, John Forsythe, describes what happened then. The English archers advanced one step forward and shot their arrows with such force and quickness that it seemed it snowed. Bowmen let fly then at large, and did not lose a single shaft, for every arrow told on horse or man. So the knights in the first French battle fell, slain or sore-stricken, almost without seeing the men who slew them. It was not only the bow that brought the foot soldier decisively back into the battlefield. These 2 weapons were the other successful challenge to feudal cavalry, the long spear and the halberd, and it was the Swiss who mastered them. In the 14th and 15th centuries, they formed up in dense masses of spearmen who spitted the cavalry on their pikes. In the center of this thicket of spears stood soldiers armed with halberds, 2-handed swords, or vicious spiked weapons called lucerne hammers. These men stopped the enemy from penetrating the formation and then rushed out to attack him when he wavered. The wounds inflicted by their weapons were horrifying, even by the standards of the day. You can see the effect on this skull, recently dug up from one of the old battlefields. The Swiss gained a sinister reputation for never giving quarter. With the long spear and the bow, the infantry was able to regain its vital role in warfare during these centuries. In many essentials, warfare was now little different from in Greek or Roman times. But A new phenomenon was being introduced that would soon fundamentally change its nature. From the 17th century onwards, the infantryman's life has been dominated by the firearm. Ever since, his tactics have been governed by its changing characteristics, and his training has revolved around the drills required to master it. On the smoky battlefields of the 1600s, the infantryman's firearm was the cumbersome matchlock musket, with an effective range of perhaps 100 yards and a rate of fire of 1 or 2 rounds a minute. The business of priming, loading and firing was slow and painstaking. The musket was heavy, weighing at least 12 pounds, and had to be supported by a forked rest. The musketeer had to keep his match, a length of cord soaked in saltpeter, alight and trimmed. No easy task in wet or windy weather.
Presents. Fire! Fire! Fire!
17th century infantry formations consisted of a mixture of pikemen and musketeers, and they combined the fire effect of the musket with the physical shock of the pike. The invention of the socket bayonet made the pike obsolete. It fitted over the musket's muzzle, leaving the soldier free to load and fire. Bayonet fights were rare because one side or the other usually ran first. But they certainly happened, as Captain Charles Francois discovered at Borodino. We dashed towards the redoubt and clambered in through the embrasures. I went in just after a piece had been discharged. The Russian gunners received us with handspikes and rammers, and we fought them hand to hand. During the First World War, few soldiers were killed or wounded by bayonets. But for the Australians, with their formidable reputation for toughness, they were a favorite weapon for close combat.
When you were in a trench, you're looking all ways, not knowing which way they're coming. When you're with a bayonet and you're quick enough, you do it quicker than firing.
Right, fall in semicircle, round me.
Modern armies still use the bayonet.
We're running about that set, there, so you can all see the bayonet. The bayonet is designed to kill. When a bayonet is produced in battle, fixed to a rifle, the enemy, my goodness, it's got a considerable effect on their morale. Now today I'm going to show you how to kill with a bayonet. What's the bayonet used for?
Kill!
To kill what?
Yes!
With what?
A bayonet!
Well done, fall in! Pivot! One thrust at a number of enemy. At the walk, advance! And down! 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 Any questions? Listening everywhere? Pivot! What's the aim?
To kill!
What's the aim? What's the aim?
To kill!
Listening, on guard! Pivot! Front rank, one thrust a number of enemy. At the double this time. Advance!
Today there are still moments when soldiers meet hand to hand. A few Argentinians died on the bayonet in the Falklands.
Well done! Bring your rifle with you, son. Don't let it go.
Useful though the bayonet may have been, it was the firearm that really mattered. And technology has transformed it. It was the Industrial Revolution that changed the face of warfare out of all recognition, as indeed it changed so much else. The inventions, the improved technology, and the mass production of the 19th century introduced new, more reliable, more effective weapons. We can get an idea of the scope and variety of the developments in firearms from this pattern room. This is the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield in England, and there are similar establishments in many other countries. Here can be found a prototype or an example of some 4,000 rifles and machine guns from all over the world. For nearly 200 years, there had been scarcely any significant developments in weaponry, and now suddenly they came with a rush. From the flintlock musket to the rifle musket of the American Civil War, the French chassepot, the .303 Lee Enfield, the Vickers medium machine gun, the Bren light machine gun, the German Schmeisser submachine gun, and the new British SA-80. The flintlock Brown Bess was the British musket of the Napoleonic period. The involved process of loading and firing meant the infantrymen fought in line to deliver the maximum firepower.
Fire!
The thin red line was not just poetic fantasy. The rifled musket of the American Civil War had a more reliable percussion lock and fired a conical bullet down a rifled barrel. Yet the process of loading and firing had changed relatively little, and the infantrymen still fought standing up in line. This is Saint-Privat in northeastern France. The date, August the 18th, 1870. France and Prussia are at war. Lined in defensive position along this track is the 70th French Regiment. Coming up the slope, the elite Prussian Guard. They are met by withering fire from the French and blown away like chaff. Within 20 minutes, 8,000 men lie dead and wounded on that slope. A revolution has occurred in infantry weaponry. And the revolution is this, used by the French that day, the chassepot, named after its inventor. The radical innovation lies here. It's a breech loader. It means that the soldier using it can fire, reload, fire again, without ever having to stop or stand up and break cover, as he used to have to do with his old muzzleloader. And the effect also is that it has more than doubled his rate of fire. Moreover, this is a rifled barrel, and it's effective at up to 600 meters. It gave an enormous advantage to the defense. The effect upon soldiers attacking in line abreast was utterly devastating, as the Prussians discovered here to their cost. But tragically, for hundreds of thousands of men in the years to come, and particularly in the First Great War, many commanders failed to learn the lessons of this obscure French meadow. It was with rifles like this British Lee Enfield that the armies of 1914 went to war. Once he had loaded his magazine, the soldier could fire as fast as he could work the bolt. Some regulars could get off 30 rounds a minute at a massed target.
It was a great relief when they did start attacking, or they started advancing towards us in absolute crowds, massed together in crowds, and we opened fire and were blazing away at them. Well, it was quite a relief to be able to get some of our own back. Up to now, we'd always been at the receiving end, and now for we had an opportunity of getting our own back on them.
I used 4 rifles that morning. They jammed one after the other with the continuous firing. No aiming, just loading and pulling the trigger, you know.
The Vickers, a medium machine gun solidly mounted on a tripod and fed by a belt of ammunition, has been called the concentrated essence of infantry. The German equivalent of the Vickers was the Spandau, and dreaded by the British.
If you imagine a well-placed machine gun, a line of soldiers advancing, well, if the machine gun is to one side and they can shoot straight up the line, well, one burst of fire might hit a dozen or 20 men.
And when you had the German machine gun, you'd wonder how they missed anybody. Not if they hit anybody, you know, squirming along.
We all hated the damn things because they were so desperately efficient.
Another threat was the grenade. an old weapon revived for trench fighting.
With the early ones, you had what they call a fusee. They had a little wick on them, and you lit the end of the fuse like a cracker. Then the next bomb come out, it had on the end of that wick, they had a little vestas top, a match top. And they gave us a matchbox side pinned on there or tied on, and you just struck the bomb head or the vestas there on it, and it would start to fuse, see? And off she went. But no one held it much more than it didn't go 4.5 seconds before you got rid of it.
Both sides used an ever-increasing quantity of hand grenades. The German grenade had a stick attached and earned its nickname from its similarity to an old-fashioned potato masher. Some grenades could be fired from rifles. Yet more deadly than grenade or machine gun was the towering rage of the artillery. The sheer weight of fire which bore down upon the infantryman finally drove him underground. Now, this trench in Sanctuary Wood at Ypres has been patched up rather than preserved, but we can still see some of the features that gave trench warfare its own distinctive and ghastly character. The trench was a zigzag, and this was partly so that one single shell burst could not devastate a whole line of trench, and partly so that each bay could be defended if the enemy infiltrated himself into any part of the system. But struggling round these bays, carrying a wounded man on a stretcher, was a painful and exhausting business. Men lived in dugouts, entered by steps leading from the trench. Sometimes these were relatively comfortable, but their occupants had to live with the risk of being buried alive, either if the entrance was blown in or if the whole structure collapsed under a heavy shell. Wooden duckboards covered the bottom of the trench, while pumps tried to keep them from flooding. All too often, though, the trench was deep in mud, water, and filth, and infested with ravening rats.
Everybody was lousy, and every time you went to the loo, you'd run your thumb up the seams of your trousers and crack them there. They were going off like a machine gun firing. And everybody was the same. We had the clothes for over 12 months before we had a change. We had a change at Popperinge. Easy 12 months after we'd left England.
This trench would have been deep enough for men to have walked along the middle, like this, without being seen. And on the enemy side ran the fire step, a narrow ridge on which men could stand to fire over the parapet.
There's a ledge behind your back. That's to guard your back, you see, in case a shell falls behind. But actually, it was your table. It was your dining table. And a little cavity there, you see, you used to make a fire in and put a slight grid in front and cook on top of it. And you were actually supplied with coal and wood to make a fire to cook your food.
These rusty fragments are remnants of the mass of trench stores, rolls of barbed wire, wire pickets, corrugated iron, sandbags, and so on, which were an essential part of trench warfare. They helped to make life barely tolerable, but they all had to be carried up from far in the rear by infantrymen, often exhausted, through hundreds of yards of communication trench. Big battles apart, the infantryman lived in his strangely old-fashioned troglodyte world. It had much in common with siege operations in previous wars. That hardy annual body armor reappeared. Steel helmets, some of them with a curiously medieval appearance, were here to stay.
The bright spots in the trenches used to be when it happened to be a lovely fine day and you'd suddenly see a lark spin up into the sky and sing its heart out, and you'd think, my God, don't I wish I was you, you know? And then, of course, too, there were long periods of boredom.
World War I was the epitome of the infantryman's war, forcing him to seek safety in trenches. Since then, the foot soldier has acquired protection of a different sort in the armoured personnel carrier, developed during the Second World War.
Cut!
The The APC enables him to keep pace with armor and protects him against bullets and shell splinters. It also helps keep out gas and even nuclear fallout. But there comes a moment when the door opens and the infantryman is on his feet with his rifle in the same unforgiving world that his fathers knew. He has some new weapons to help him meet new threats, just as the longbow harassed the medieval knight. So infantry anti-tank weapons threaten enemy armored vehicles on the battlefield of the 80s. Tanks are a formidable enemy to the foot soldier, but infantry are dangerous vermin too, hard to brush out of the seams of the soil. Indeed, if tanks are to survive in close country or towns, they need their own infantry to protect them. Flamethrowers first appeared in World War I, but they have been a conspicuous feature in all the succeeding wars. The Americans in particular used fire to burn out the stubborn Japanese defenders of the Pacific Islands. And the infantryman has his own artillery, the mortar. It's light enough to be dismantled and carried by its crew, and fires high angle, over obstacles and from behind cover. Its projectile, arriving with a sinister, feathery shuffle, was loathed by soldiers in all armies. And the infantry rifle itself can lay down a weight of fire that the musketeer would never have dreamed of. But whatever weapon the infantryman carries, his war retains its own hard edge. Nothing can free him from his obligation to close and kill. In war, possession is 9 points of the law, and the infantrymen are the bailiff's men. In 1941, on the Eastern Front, the victorious Germans reached Stalingrad. After a devastating aerial bombardment, it was the task of the infantrymen to take the town. But the Germans had underestimated the resistance of the Russian soldier, defending his city block by block, street by street, house by house.
Thousands of sorties of our dive bombers, Stuka bombers, bombed the city, so there was so much rubble you couldn't, even with the tank, you could hardly move. Therefore, we formed small sections, especially fitted with submachine gun. Fighting in a street is a very dangerous affair, because behind any door, behind any window, even from the roof, you get some fire, there are snipers, and the enemy is in a shelter throwing hand grenades. You have to run very fast, or you have to creep. You have to depend on your neighbor. We went creeping and running and supporting one the other, and we threw hand grenades. We fired our submachine guns. So this action took weeks and weeks, and therefore our strength, the division faded out.
The courage and street fighting tactics of the Soviet soldiers finally wore down the endurance and skill of the world's most professional troops. The ruins of Stalingrad became the graveyard of the German 6th Army. In most World War II campaigns, infantry bore the brunt of the fighting. They formed a quarter of the British Army, but suffered 3/4 of the casualties. The pressure of life in the line was relentless. In Omar Bradley's famous phrase, behind every river was another hill, and behind that hill, another river. Each encounter reduced the rifleman's chance of survival. Sooner or later, the chase had to end on a stretcher or in the grave. For For the infantryman, the moment came all too often when he had to go forward into the firing line.
May the 23rd was the breakout from Anzio. And a few days before, we were called by the brigadier, and we sat down, and he was telling us, a wonderful moment has happened, we're going to break out of here, and your regiment has been chosen. And then suddenly I found it was my platoon. It was to be the first to have to break out of Anzio. We had to go up to a river bank and hide there. And one of the men whom I most trusted, and who was actually our signals man, he just couldn't bear it any longer. I was very fond of him, but he shot himself through the foot. And so I lost him, and I lost our signals man. And it was a really terrible experience that somebody whom one was very fond of and who one trusted should do that and was betraying us. But luckily, our doctor gave me a Benzedrine, and I think I popped that in. It certainly made an awful lot of difference at the time. And I felt once one actually got going in this final attack, which was a diversionary attack, actually, and the main attack was made by the Americans further south. But you had a great sense of elation. I'm not sure whether it was the Benzedrine that gave me that feeling, but certainly I went across. Then I did this terrible thing. I led the platoon across some open ground and did something that was entirely against all the rules that I had been taught. And we went round, instead of going behind a German machine gun post, we went round in front. And of course, they were all mown down, and somehow I escaped. But it was a thing that weighed on my mind tremendously for years later.
Combat for the infantryman has always been dangerous and confusing. Ammunition Hill is on the outskirts of Jerusalem. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, it was honeycombed with trenches and bunkers and resolutely defended by the Jordanians. The close-range battle to take the hill was a microcosm of infantry combat.
The real problem is to identify where are you, who is shooting at you, from where. The moment you start to move, you get bullets or you get a hand grenade. This is a difficult job. If you hear shouts of your friends that are trying to identify themselves, so by shouting to each other, you create communication. Watch it, I'm here, don't throw a grenade here, let me move forward, cover me, or things of this type. The whole night of fighting here was in the shade of confusion. We were moving forward inside the trenches. Suddenly you discover that what you thought were friends of you who were going behind you were not, but your enemy that was going behind you, not knowing that actually you are ahead of him. And the question was, who would use his senses better to find out actually in every second and every minute of the fight what is actually happening around you. While fighting, you concentrate in what you're doing, you try to survive. You're so busy doing it that you don't have anything else in your mind. There were few moments that were terrifying. First moment that actually you see with your own eyes that your close friends got killed. You see his face, you see his eyes, he's not moving. It's a terrible experience, terrible.
For all its intensity, battle is a comparatively rare event in the infantryman's life. Mostly he must trudge on, weighed down by rifle and pack.
A typical day in the field was usually a hot walk in the sun. You would go out on what they called an operation, combat operation, search and destroy mission, search and destroy, search for and destroy the enemy, or search for and destroy the enemy's supplies or his food. For the most part, you didn't wash. You slept very little on those operations. You ate sea rations out of a can, unheated, dried food. And it was always hot. It was blazing hot. There was a great deal of fear involved. You never knew when something was going to happen. The possibility existed that anybody could step on a mine. You had a certain tour to do. We had 13 months in Vietnam, and the days seemed longer than they were. The time seemed never to go away. The time seemed never to pass. And then there would be a firefight. You could be in a firefight for 3 or 4 hours, and it felt like 10 minutes. Tour of duty in Vietnam as an infantryman was hours and hours of boredom followed by seconds of sheer terror.
It is a timeless description of the infantryman's experience, for his essential features remain unchanging. The weapon, the pack, the helmet, and the eyes that have seen too much of that old, hard world that he knows so well.